Mark chapter 7, selected verses 24 through 37. Jesus arose and went away in the region of Tyre and Sidon, and entered a house, and did not want anyone to know. Yet he could not be hidden. But immediately a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit heard of him, and came and fell down at his feet. Now the woman was a Gentile, a Syrophoenician by birth, and she begged him to cast the demon out of her daughter. And he said to her, "Let the children be fed first, for it's not right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she answered him, "Lord, yes, even yet the dogs under the table eat the children's crumbs." And he said to her, "For this statement you may go your way. The demon has left your daughter." And she went home and found the child lying in bed and the demon gone. Then he returned from the region of Tyre and Sidon, went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. And they brought to him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment. And they begged him to lay his hand on him. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers into the man's ears, and after spitting, touched his tongue. Looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, "Ephphatha," that is to say, "be opened." And his ears were opened, and his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. And Jesus charged them to tell no one. And the more he charged them, the more zealously they proclaimed it. And they were astonished beyond measure, saying, "He has done all things well. He even makes the deaf to hear and the mute to speak." This is the word of the Lord. You may be seated. So Jesus goes into this region of Tyre and Sidon and finds a house where he thought he could be secluded and protected from the pressing crowds. You must understand that wherever he went, he was almost crushed to death by people pressing in on him to touch him. And he got exhausted. He got tired from time to time. That's why he would go and spend time alone on a mountain to pray, and occasionally he would seek solace, simply a place to get away from the buzzing crowd, the pressing crowd. How many of you have ever needed time alone? Even if you're married, come on, be honest. Especially if you're married. We all need me time. We all need time alone, and it doesn't matter who you are. You know, I discovered how much I appreciate solitude after being raised in a household of, 8 boys and 2 girls. I didn't have any privacy. There was never a moment of privacy in our house, or privacy if you want to use the right British pronunciation. And, with one bathroom, you can't have a lot of privacy. Matter of fact, we shared tubs. You were lucky if you got in on the first washing. Now, what I mean by that, some of y'all know what I'm talking about from bigger families. You got a good hot tub of warm hot water, but it's going to get used twice before it gets dumped, twice more. So the second is kind of like it's murky, and by the time you get to number 3, it's almost brown. Not that bad, but we were boys. We had a lot of dirt. And when the girls came along, we couldn't ever get in the bathroom. That was just, you forget We had yellow trees out back. Yellow trees. That's the color the bark ended up being. But being raised with a big family, you know, you never had a moment of quiet. And Dad made sure that there was madness all the time because he bought this Zenith stereo. No, it was RCA. That looked like a coffin. It was huge. It was big. It was big as that altar almost. Matter of fact, maybe about a foot shorter. And he had two 15-inch JBL speakers in there, and he went ahead and souped it up, just like Dad loved to soup things up. He had a 1956 Ford with a T-Bird engine in it and a police interceptor chip. So the cops could not catch him when he was driving to church. And I promise you, he always exceeded 85. Sometimes 105. In a 55 Chevrolet wagon that was converted with a Ford intercepted motor. Amazing. Dad was something else. But Dad would also, when it came to church, he loved the Bible stories, and he lived them, and he was one of those that would just simply ask the question, well, if it happened then, why can't it happen now? And he would be gullible enough to pray for people's healings, and then it would start happening in every church he ever went to. And Dad was a man of faith. So many lives were changed by his faith. Uncle Jack was one of them. My Uncle Jack was kind of like the woman at the well. He went through 5 wives before he finally found the one that, you know, that stuck with him, Aunt Peggy. But Uncle Jack he could cuss the paint off the walls. And I just got used to him cussing, you know, it just seemed like breathing for him. It didn't offend me even. Being a preacher's son, I just knew Uncle Jack, that's how he talked. He would spice things up with an occasional GD or something like that, you know. And he used the F word, and he just always was cussing. So it seemed normal. And Dad would always talk to my Uncle Jack and witness to him every time we get together, and it made me mad because they were having so much fun singing and playing the guitars, and then Uncle Jack would always get upset when Dad would talk about Jesus. He'd say, Jack, have you given your heart to Jesus yet? And Uncle Jack would get mad and storm out of the house, and we'd all get mad at Dad for making Uncle Jack mad. And it happened every year. Every Christmas, every time we got together, Uncle Jack would sit there with a guitar and play with Dad, and they'd play Wabash Cannonball and all those songs they all knew. Bill Monroe, what's that band that used to play Texas Swing? Bob Wills Band. They knew all the Bob Wills Band songs. And man, they could tear it up. So I loved to hear them sing and have fun, but the minute Dad would say, Jack, have you thought about going to church? Have you thought about getting your life straight? Well, there you go again. And he'd storm out of the house and slam the door, and we'd say, Dad, you did it again. And that happened all the time. And I remember one day I was eating lunch at the house, and Uncle Jack would come and Momo would cook for him. She cooked these garden fresh veggies, you know, and we'd have chicken fried steak and butter beans and cornbread and, you know, white gravy. Hope I'm making you hungry. She'd pound that chicken fried steak, though. She had a meat cleaver. She'd pound the snot out of it and make it just as tender as it'd melt in your mouth. But Uncle Jack came in the house that day, and I thought, you could always tell when he walked in the door because he'd be cussing. He'd be cussing. And on this particular day, it was 1974, he came in the back door. He always came in the front door. So I didn't understand why he came in the back door that day. And instead of GD, it was hallelujah. I thought, oh my God, somebody's killed Uncle Jack, put somebody else in his body. He hollered hallelujah like a Pentecostal preacher. I thought, what has happened to Jack? And he had the night before slipped off into a church the lights were on, and they were having a revival service. He was carrying his load of sin, and he walked in there and put it all at the foot of the cross in one night, and was a different man from that day forward. Never the same again. Matter of fact, he brought, by his testimony alone and the way his life changed so drastically, over 30 people at Peerless Steel came to Jesus because of Jack Putnam, the foreman at the steel plant who got saved. And my dad didn't do it. It didn't happen on a get-together at Christmas. It didn't happen at Thanksgiving. And I'm sure, though, that every time my dad talked to him, it was another seed planted in his heart. And I want to remind you about that with your loved ones. And you might have a black cat in your family, or black sheep, if you will. I'm sure we all do have one or two rascals, right? If you don't, you probably will. And the thing is, we should pray for them and understand that God is at work. And don't look at your evangelizing them as something that, a decision that you've got to see happen before your very eyes. As a matter of fact, some people will be converted after you're dead and gone. And you won't see it with your physical eyes. But the promise is to you and to your children and your children's children. The promise of salvation, if you really study the Bible, is household salvation. And the gospel is for you and your children and your children's children, and as many as are afar off, whom the Lord our God will call. That means subsequent generations. So household salvation is promised to us, but will we see it with our own physical eyes? Maybe they might be converted after we're dead and gone, who knows? But my dad never gave up on my Uncle Jack, and for good reason. He became a wonderful Christian. Now, that's not to say he was a terrible person to start with, because we're all stinkers. We all are. We've all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. And, you know, we can throw rocks at him and say, well, you know, he had all those marriages. The problem was he was fishing in the wrong pond. He was going to bars. You don't find a good spouse in a bar. I stand corrected. You can if that spouse turns to Jesus. But if you think you're going to save that spouse and you met him in a bar, most likely they're going to meet someone else in a bar. But that was unfortunately where he was fishing in the wrong ponds, and he found Peggy in church. And that was the marriage that took. So what am I saying to say this? This woman came to Jesus for a healing. Her daughter was possessed. Now, there is such a thing as possession. It's horrible. And in this case, it was from childhood. She had no control over it. Just like the 7-year-old who threw himself in the fire and tried to drown himself in the water, and the demons were killing that little boy, that 7-year-old, and Jesus healed the boy, but only after the disciples couldn't cast it out. So here she's Syrophoenician. That means she's Persian, of Persian descent. She's not Jewish. I want to straighten the story out for you, though, because a lot of people get it wrong. They say, isn't it just awful that he called that woman a dog? And you just misread the story. He never called her a dog, not once. He said, now just be honest. How many of you know that, how many of you have a dog in your house? Be honest. All right. How many of you let the dog eat at the same time you're eating at the table? You've learned over time, though. But after you've learned over time not to feed the dog scraps while you're eating, especially if there's company over. How many of you do it when the company's present? Do you feed a dog scraps under the table with company present? Be honest. That's it. It's because Jesus is simply saying there's a time and a place to feed a dog, but you don't do it at the table. Not normally. If you have company present, it's not kosher to do so. Now, I know it's tempting, especially when the dog likes something that you hate, like fried okra. I hated it, and my dog would love to eat it, and Mom would say, "Have you eaten your okra yet?" "I'm eating it now, Mama." And the dog's going, "Hump, hump, 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 hump." I fed that dog so much fried okra, I thought he was going to turn into a fried okra. Beans. Billy would feed the dog beans. Don't ever feed a dog beans. Not a good idea. So here she's Syrophoenician, but he's not calling her a dog. He's saying, you know, there's a time to feed the dog. And even the dogs, you know, the children eat first. It's not a, although I have met some people, I'm not going to name any names, but I've met some people, even in recent churches, who will feed their dog better than I'm eating, I guarantee you. Steak. We're not talking Alpo here. We're not talking, you know, dried dog food. We're talking steak. And it ain't gravy train. That dog's got the gravy train though. But some dogs have just got it made. And if you're one of those that does that, don't get offended that I'm talking about it. But just know that there are dogs that do eat dry dog food. And slop. When I was growing up, we called it slop, and we would slop the dogs. And they would eat whatever was left over. And what the dogs wouldn't eat, we would throw to the catfish. Boy, am I getting nostalgic. Let the children first be filled. It's not right to take that bread that you were going to feed them and give it to a dog. Now, is that calling her a dog? No. Why do we just assume that Jesus was calling her a dog? Because it sounds like it. You're reading the way the story reads, you go, well, wow, he just called her a dog. No, he didn't. But she said, and she was pretty quick-tongued, Jesus loved wit and humor, and he would reward it. I think he laughed at her joke because she said, yeah, you know, even a dog's got to eat, though. And isn't that a good response? Even a dog's got to eat. He's not calling her a dog, but she's saying, yeah, but eventually you do feed that dog, don't you? You're not going to let it starve. And he laughed and said, you know, because you have faith, your child is delivered right this minute. And he spoke the word, even though she wasn't present, miles away, demons came screaming out of that little girl. All because of her faith. And then, right next up, Jesus is talking to a man who's never spoken. And he's in a town called Decapolis. How many of you have taken a little bit of Greek, or you know a little bit about Roman words? The Decapolis is a Roman word, and it means one of the 10. Decathlon, Decapolis, one of the 10 capital city. Decapolis is one of the 10 cities that were on the Roman roads around Jerusalem. And this was the principal city of the 10. So there were more saunas there, more shops, more trading booths, and you can go to Decapolis today and there's these huge pillars and the Roman road is still there. It's really cool to kind of look at this place. I was impressed with the plumbing. We got stone potties with running water still running under the stone potties that the Romans made over 2,000 years ago, and I can't get my plumbing to last 12 years without having to be replaced. I was impressed with their plumbing. I thought, well, look at this. It's still floating stuff on down the pipe, you know, right there. And the commodes were still there. The holes still there after all these years. The roads were still there. The bridges were still there. We can't even build a bridge that'll hold up in San Francisco without it collapsing, right? So the Syrophoenician woman got her healing. Now this man, he can't hear, can't talk. Never spoke in his life. And here's what happens. It says here, as he departed there into that area near the Sea of Galilee, in the city of Decapolis, that he went there to the mountain area and sat down. And they brought to him one who was deaf. He had a speech impediment. And they all asked him to put his hand on him, and he did. He took him aside from the crowd privately and put his fingers into his ears. Now, this is a healing that Jesus did that I do not recommend you duplicate. You know, a lot of times we want to pray like Jesus prayed. Do not spit in someone's ear unless the Lord instructs you to do so, because they might get offended. But that's what he did. He spit on his finger, stuck that wet woolly in the fellow's ear. That's what we called a wet woolly when I was a kid. You know, you spit on it. If you've never had a wet woolly, you don't know what I'm talking about. But he spit on his finger, stuck it in there. That's kind of gross when you think, but he did. That's what he did. And so some people, that when they read the Bible, they want to do exactly like Jesus did. I've seen preachers actually spit on their finger and pray for somebody. But he touched his tongue with that spit. And then looking up to heaven, he gave a big sigh, and he said, "Epaphta," which in the Hebrew means to be opened. And his ears were opened instantly, and the bond on his tongue, he was tongue-tied. The bond on his tongue was loosened. He could speak, and he spoke plainly, and they charged him that he should tell no man. Interesting, a lot of times Jesus would tell people that just got healed, "Now don't tell anybody." Well, that's hard for a person who's been blind all their life or lame, and they're running out of the building. "Now don't tell anybody you can hop." And it says the more they asked him to shut up, the more he spoke. It says he published it a great deal. Now that's called news today, although we don't know what news is now. But he was publishing the news of his healing. And they were beyond measure astonished, saying, "He has done all things well. He makes the dumb to hear, the deaf to hear, the dumb to speak." And Matthew tells us that there came unto him great crowds, multitudes of people, having with them not just one person who was lame, not just one person who was deaf, not just one person who was maimed or even dumb. It said many others, and they cast them down at his feet. He healed them all. So when you're reading this story in Mark, don't get the mistaken impression that it was just one person. He was healing deaf people, opening deaf ears, tongues that had never spoken were speaking, lame people were walking, insomuch that the crowd wondered. The multitude was amazed when they saw the dumb speak, the maimed whole, and the lame walking, and the blind seeing, and they glorified the God of Israel. And Jesus called unto him his disciples and said, "I have compassion on the multitude, because they continue with me now 3 days and have nothing to eat, and I would not send them away fainting or fasting." And then he feeds them. Feeds 5,000 or 4,000 this time. So again, he feeds the crowd. I think it's interesting when we look at manna from heaven and Jesus talking about being the bread of life, how so very often he feeds the multitude to prove he is the same manna that fell in the wilderness. He's the same bread of life, and he's the same Savior. So rejoice in his provision for you. He will always intervene. He answers every prayer. He can do far beyond what you ask or think. You know, years ago, I got spoiled by being in a church full of miracles. And I saw so many miracles, I simply cannot stop believing for God to do supernatural things. I saw babies who had never talked speak for the first time and hear for the first time, and you could see on their faces it was an authentic, real healing. And I saw miracle after miracle after miracle. So can God do it again? I'm convinced the only thing that stops him is our unbelief. The only thing that will slow down a miracle is failure to believe he is able. What's Satan's greatest deception? To make someone think he doesn't exist. So believe, have faith, and just that initiation of faith, even through a joke, might be the very catalyst or springboard for the healing you're asking God for. Wouldn't it be fun to make Jesus chuckle just to get your healing? Some of us do. I know he laughs at me all the time. This is the word of the Lord. Rejoice and know that God is able to do now what he did then, and he never changes. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. Amen.